This is going to lead us to our next slide here on non-traditional aid. This is kind of an interesting one because, like I said before, if I were to ask you who helped the Americans during the American Revolution, I guess the traditional answers are going to be European countries. And like I mentioned before, the European aid was extremely important. But on a non-traditional level, there were people that stepped up from within the country, patriots, people that believe very strongly in independence, that also played a major role. In the first guy here, I'm not going to talk about everyone. I'm not even going to talk about a lot. I'm going to talk about two that don't often get a lot of press. But one is Francis Marion. He's known as the Swamp Fox, mainly because foxes, by definition, or I guess kind of what we associate with them, is a slyness or a feeling of being sneaky. And the swamp aspect of his nickname is the fact that he traveled by the cover of night. He was sort of very secretive in his approach. He was, I guess if we were to say he was the leader of the guerrilla warfare movement, he was the one that really proved its effectiveness. So he does use guerrilla warfare, and a quick little definition of guerrilla warfare is someone who uses hit and run tactics, as opposed to the gentleman's warfare where I say, I'll meet you back at 3 o'clock, you go first, then I'll return fire. As opposed to that sort of traditional way of fighting, guerrilla warfare is more hiding behind trees and sneaking up on your enemy and not exposing yourself to your enemy. Guerrilla warfare is hit and run, shoot, and then get out of there. Don't wait for return fire. Now, again, if you ask the British during this time period what they called guerrilla warfare, they would say cowardly fighting or ungentlemanly fighting because that's how they perceived it. Well, like I said before, people like George Washington and Francis Marion didn't care about being gentlemanly. They didn't care about drinking tea with their enemies at the end of the war. They cared about winning. So what Francis Marion does, as well as many other patriots who take part in this guerrilla warfare, is they instill a sense of fear and paranoia into the British. Now what this does is, picture this, again, traveling down the back country of Virginia, having no idea where you're going, just wearing your red coats as a British soldier and trying to get from point A to point B. But again, not having a clear sense of where you are, when all of a sudden, out of the blue, someone gets shot in the back. One person gets shot from a tree. No one sees it coming. It just is, you're shot, you hear the gunshot, someone falls over. Everyone looks around in all different directions trying to figure out where the shot came from. And before they're able to even sort of identify the direction it came from, the shooter is gone. And again, that was Francis Marion. He didn't kill 1,000,000 people. He didn't even kill 1,000 people. But his job, his role in the revolution was drastic because all of a sudden the British stopped traveling through the forests. They stopped traveling at a brisk speed. They slowed down dramatically. And again, they traveled with a sense of paranoia, constantly looking over their shoulder, wondering if they were going to be the next one to be attacked by Francis Marion or anyone else. I mean, truly, people believed, and if you've ever seen the movie The Patriot, Mel Gibson's character is loosely based on Francis Marion. The idea that he was able to cause such a problem amongst the British as one person. And I'm not talking about the George Washington of the Revolution. I'm talking about an unknown quantity or a person that you don't really talk a whole lot about with the American Revolution. He was one of many men that took part in this type of warfare, this effective type of warfare. All right, on a completely different level, I want to talk about a woman during this war, and her name is Deborah Sampson. Now, Deborah Sampson's role in this war is, again, not some huge monumental, like, because of her we won the war, but it shows just what kind of patriots were out there. And again, they weren't all the names that we've heard of before. Deborah Sampson is probably a name that you've probably never heard. Robert Shurtleff, again, in parentheses there, next to Deborah Sampson, a name that you've probably never heard. But the idea of Deborah Sampson fighting in this war as a woman was going to be extremely, I don't know, significant in the fact that women were starting to say things like, hey, we want independence just as much as the men. We're members of the Daughters of Liberty just like the men are members of the Sons of Liberty, and we want to play an active role, and we don't just want to be the nurses on the battlefield, although that was a role that many women played. What Deborah Sampson does is she kind of goes all Mulan on the Americans, cuts her hair, wears male clothing, and basically dresses as a male soldier. She enlists in the Continental Army, and she goes off and she fights. And she's very successful in her first few stages of the American Revolution until she gets to the Battle of Kings Mountain, where she is injured. She's shot in the leg, not mortally or anything like that. She's shot in the leg. She wraps it up. She says, I'm fine. She continues to fight, and then the next thing you know, she passes out. Well, the soldiers all kind of knew what was happening to her. They could see the symptoms rising in her, or I should say him, because they believed his name was Robert Shurtleff. They could see what was happening to her. They could see she had contracted yellow fever and that she needed to be treated quickly or she would die. So they take her to the hospital, one of these makeshift hospitals in the back of the battlefield, and they start to, take care of the wound. They start by tearing her pant leg and exposing the wound, and then when they realize that it has spread up her leg, they tear off her pants entirely, and whoa, they discover that Deborah or Robert Shirtliff is not a man, she is a woman. I won't describe exactly how they discover that, but they do. So what happens is Deborah Sampson is discovered. The fact that she is not Robert Shirtliff, that she is Deborah Sampson, and that she is a woman fighting in this war. The men that fought alongside her were blown away by this. They said, "What are you talking about? Bobby Shirtliff, my boy on the battlefield there, someone I would trust my life with, the manliest man out there, that's not a woman." But she was. And so the reality of it is that we start seeing that women, believe it or not, were equals to men, not just, in the fields or not just with education, but also on the battlefield. So she actually, this goes a long way for women's rights here, but she isn't reprimanded. She's honorably discharged, which means that she's removed from the Continental Army, but she kind of served her purpose, or she proved her point. The other roles that women play, and just kind of like a little side note here, is that some women actually acted as spies. I talked about the idea of nursing and all that stuff and staying home while men left to go fight. Women stayed home and they kind of took care of the towns that were abandoned by the men. But they also acted as spies. And by spies, I mean that they would show up at local taverns that were frequented by British soldiers, and they would use their womanly charm, and they would flirt with those British soldiers, and they would say things like, "Oh, you're so muscular," and grabbing their arms and saying, "You must work out." And the British soldiers totally biting, taking the bait, and starting to brag about their conquests and about how they are going to sneak up on the Americans, the silly Americans who aren't going to see it coming. We're going to sneak up on them, we're going to catch them off guard, and we're going to, crush them, and this revolution is going to be over before you know it. Well, of course, the women would leave the bar and they would cross the street to where the Patriots were hanging out, and they would start to deliver some of the information, the secret, top secret information that the British men had just exposed. So women played a very active role and oftentimes don't get talked about in the history textbooks, but certainly you can't underplay or, underscore the significance of women in this war. All right, which is going to lead me to my next sort of random side note about the revolution, and that's going to be good old Benedict Arnold. Now we start to see during the revolution, especially as it wages on and gets longer and longer into the years of the revolution, many people believe that this would be a quick war one way or the other, but we start to figure out early on that it's not the case. And as the war drags on and as soldiers aren't being paid and as they're starving to death and they're dealing with their wounds, people start to look to the other side where the grass is greener. The Americans were, in a lot of ways gravely underpaid, and in some cases not paid at all, and certainly in some situations underappreciated, like good old Benedict Arnold. Now, Benedict Arnold was an American general and a very successful one. Now, as an American general, what he does is he fights for the American cause very, bravely and valiantly and all those things, and he doesn't get the recognition that he thinks he deserves. So what happens is, as the story goes, that Benedict Arnold decides to sell some very important documents, some battle plans to the British. Now, although those battle plans are delivered and do find their way into the hands of the British, no real damage is done. But that's not the point. The point is that the war is not lost for the Americans because of what Benedict Arnold does. The idea of the fact that he does it is what really is more damaging. So the fact that Benedict Arnold, one of these high-ranking American generals, decides to change sides during the war, gets people to start saying things like, if Benedict Arnold could turn sides, who's next? Is George Washington going to potentially become a traitor? I mean, who's next? That's how high-ranking Benedict Arnold was at this point, and that's how damaging this maneuver was. And I oftentimes think about it because today we sort of think of the word Benedict Arnold and we almost associate it with the term traitor. And so, like, if I were to say something today, like if I were to call you a Benedict Arnold, oh, don't be a Benedict Arnold, if I say that to you, it's not a compliment, which is sad for Benedict Arnold because he did a lot of good in his day. And as a Red Sox fan, I oftentimes associate this to good old Bill Buckner. And Bill Buckner was a first baseman for the Red Sox. This would be my side little Red Sox tangent for you. Bill Buckner was a first baseman for the Red Sox, and he played for them for a number of years and was very successful and an all-star and had so many game-winning hits and a great defensive player and all these different things. Yet, if you go to Boston today and you mention Bill Buckner's name, you're likely to get punched in the face, and the reason why is because Bill Buckner is most remembered for one play, which is sad because he made so many good plays. But the one play is in 1986 in Game 6 of the World Series when the Red Sox were playing the New York Mets, and it had gone, 80 some odd years without a World Series. Not 80, 70 some odd years without a World Series at this point. Bill Buckner is playing first base when Mookie Wilson, cool New York Mets name, Mookie Wilson hits a nice little ground ball to him. Bottom of the ninth inning, there are 2 outs. He picks up the ball, steps on first base. The game's over. The Red Sox win the World Series. But that's, of course, not what happens. The ball rolls through his legs. Bill Buckner lets the ball get away from him. Tying run scores. The next run scores. The Red Sox end up losing that Game 6, going on to lose Game 7. And forever, Bill Buckner is going to be remembered as a bum, which is unfortunate because he wasn't. So anyways, again, going back to Benedict Arnold, the idea of being sort of remembered for one event in your life, even though it was pretty drastic, is a sad reality of how we think of them today. Okay, the Treaty of Paris, real quickly. Let me just go through what happens at the end of this war. Number one is that the war ends in 1782, officially. The American Revolution ends. And the Americans basically decide to travel over to France, where their buddies, the French, who had helped them in this war, decide to be sort of the neutral ground for the British and the Americans to get together and to negotiate a treaty. The Americans that show up there, Ben Franklin, John Jay, John Adams, and Henry Lawrence, are all pretty well-known players in the Revolution. Of course, many of us have heard of Ben Franklin and John Adams. John Jay becomes our first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and was seen as one of the more fair Americans living during this time period, someone who saw both sides of the story, as did someone like John Adams. And Henry Lawrence was the governor of New York at this time, and in a lot of ways, a loyalist that turned patriot. And so he was kind of someone who could see both sides of the story. So these were going to be people that were well-known, well-respected during this time period that were going to be negotiating for the terms of the treaty. So what did it actually say? Number one is that Britain was going to recognize the United States as an independent nation. That's the whole purpose of the revolution. It's why we're fighting it. We want to be independent. We want to do our own thing. So that's going to be first and foremost. Number two is it was going to expand our borders. They were going to extend from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. That was what the United States would look like. Everything east of the Mississippi River would be part of the United States. Everything west of it was actually going to be given to or allowed for the Spanish. The third thing on the list there is that the borders would also extend north to south from the Great Lakes to the northern border of Florida, which was going to be returned to Spain. Here's kind of a cool little move on the part of the Americans. They didn't have any money at the end of the Revolution because remember, with any war, there's going to be death and debt. And the debt was going to be extremely damaging for the Americans to dig themselves. It's going to be one of those things that they struggle with for the first, 20 years of the existence of the United States. So what happens is we owe Spain a lot of money at the end of this war. They've given us materials, they've given us supplies, they've given us soldiers. So because we can't pay them back with money, we decide to pay them back with Florida. We give them Florida and we say, hey, we'll give you this huge chunk of land that was yours at one point. Then you joined the wrong side during the French and Indian War, and we took that from you. Now we're going to give it back to you. So the Spanish get Florida back in 1782, and that's sort of like a cancellation of our debt. Pretty smart move, especially for a group that didn't have a lot of money. And the final thing on the list here, which is kind of funny, is that we basically say, and this is something that the British ask for, they say those loyalists, don't throw them in jail, don't beat them up, don't execute them. They were just doing what they were supposed to do. They were being loyal to their king. They were being loyal to their government. They said, please just, any land that has been taken away from them, just pay them for it. Give them, market value for their land. And of course, you got Franklin and Jay and Adams and Lawrence that are sitting there and they're like, yeah, we'll take care of that. Of course, they never do. We can't pay these loyalists for land if we can't even pay these Europeans that helped us out and gave us all this stuff to help us win this war. We're not going to give our money, the money that we have very little of, to the loyalists. All right, and finally, the outcomes. There are a couple of things that we're going to be talking about throughout the next couple of days in class that are going to be closely tied to this. Outcomes. Number one, independence. Again, that's why we fight this war. That's what we insist upon at the end of this war, to be free and independent, trade with whoever we want, tax however we want, elect rulers, governors, presidents, whatever, however, whenever we want. We also extend our borders, as mentioned before in the Treaty of Paris. But we do see things like this, like war heroes emerging. George Washington goes from being sort of a household name in America to being an international hero. I mean, people from around the world know George Washington's name now. And again, we can look to someone like George Washington and say, yeah, he's on our team, and we can take pride in that. There are going to be other heroes that will emerge. I mean, you got your Francis Marions and your Ben Franklin's and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and all these people that are our founding fathers today. But again, war heroes emerge almost out of every war, right? There are people that we credit with winning this war. Patriotism becomes a real big thing in our country. People start to wave the American flag and they start to say things like, I'm no longer a Virginian, I am an American. And again, when you can start thinking about it like that, that's kind of a cool thing. That's kind of cool to go from I'm more loyal to my state than I am to my country to saying that I'm more loyal to my country than I am to my state. And the Americans realized real quickly that they needed to work together and compromise with one another about what was going to be in the best interest of the country as opposed to what was going to be in the best interest of their state. The other thing was international respect. We start to see that more and more countries say things like, how did this even happen? Again, this is the greatest upset in world history. This is like, think about it today. I almost like equate it to, the Detroit Lions coming in and playing against our middle school football team. And as good as our middle school football team is, before you guys freak out, my football players out there that are listening to this, as good as you are, again, you had to think about going up against, 300-pound linemen. It's just not it's not a fair fight. So the reality of it is that if that's how drastic this was, and of course in this scenario, the middle school football team are the Americans and the Lions are the British, if that's how drastic this was, you can imagine what would happen if we, the middle school team, beat the Lions, how that would catch the attention of the rest of the people around the state, the country, and the world for that matter. So that's what we were seeing. This international respect was starting to come pouring out from all over the place to the United States. People said, we want to be your friends, which is the next one here, alliances. People wanted to align themselves with the great Americans who just defeated the strongest army and navy in the world. They wanted to trade with us. We had a lot of good resources, but they were coming and knocking on our door, which was kind of cool. And the final thing up here, which these are all great things, and then we get to the bottom, death and debt. Death and debt are two things that result in every war, like I mentioned at the end of the French and Indian War. But this is going to be something that's going to be devastating to the Americans. The death total, the number of Americans that die, and now when the war is over, we have to go back and sort of pretend like everything is the way it was before. We have to go back and try to continue to run our towns and our cities the way they'd been done, but with a quarter of the people or half the people that were once there. It was difficult to do. And then the debt issue, this is going to be something that is going to cause major conflict for the first few years, certainly until we establish the Constitution, the first few years of our country. This is like the big fight amongst the founding fathers as they're trying to establish the country. How are we going to dig ourselves out of debt? And someone like George Washington, who does emerge out of this war as a hero, not just militaristically, but also politically, people like George Washington say, we need to pay off our debts. We can't be that country that doesn't pay back their debts. And you all know people like this, right? You lend them money and you know that they're never going to pay you back. And then the worst part is you watch them, go to the movies on the weekend spending money that they should be giving to you or going out to dinner, and you're like, hey, how do you have enough money to go out to dinner but you can't pay me back? That's what the Americans were afraid of, that was going to be their reputation. And so Washington and many of the other founding fathers worked very hard to pay off their international debts and then, of course, their domestic debts. So that's sort of the United States following the American Revolution. There's a lot of work to still be done, I guess, to kind of put things lightly or mildly. The next couple of weeks we're going to be focusing on the government and how our government was established and what they did to establish the government and why they did it. But most of why they established the government the way they did was because of what happened as a result of the revolution. We're not going to have a king. We're going to make our money through taxation, but there's going to be representation. We are going to listen to the people. It's going to be a democracy where people are going to have a voice in the government. And again, having this sort of citizen government was going to distinguish us from most of the other countries around the world and was going to make us kind of unique and cool in a lot of ways.